Okay, everyone, we're finally at the end of the first book of Samuel. We'll be going through chapters 27 and 31. So, as a just as a reminder, last time we spoke about David, and he had had two opportunities to deal with Saul, and we know that he did not do anything against Saul because, first of all, he fears the Lord. And not only that, he still recognizes and honors and respect that Saul had been anointed king. And remember that they used the holy anointing oil of the temple to do this. So, in spite of all that Saul was doing against him, David still had honor and respect for Saul as king of Israel. So, when we go to chapter 27, we have that David again goes to the Philistines, and so he goes and approaches the king of Gath. Remember, Gath is from where Goliath was, and he approaches the king named Achish. Now, I'm not going to read through all that, just to let you know that what David was doing with his men was that he was offering himself as a mercenary to the king of the Philistines, to one of the kings of the Philistines. And he was accepted by the king, and so he stays there with them for a while, thinking King Achish that David was completely for the Philistines. Because if you go to chapter 27 towards the end, it says, verse 11, David did not leave a man or a woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, otherwise they will tell about us, saying, so has David done, and so has been his practice all the time he has lived in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he has surely made himself odious among his people Israel, therefore he will become my servant forever. And what had happened is that David goes and fights against a people which really were enemies of Israel and not enemies of Achish, but he comes with a report saying that he was doing it in favor of the Philistines. So I want to really follow the next chapters because of what happens to Saul. And it says in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. David said to Achish, very well, you shall know what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. So the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Remember that the Urim was one of the stones that the high priest wore in his breastplate, and it was used to come before the Lord and ask questions to see, for example, in this case, what was going to happen to Saul and his people against the Philistines. Should he fight it? Will he have victory against the Philistines? But not even that, nor any of the prophets or any of the people, nor even dreams, the Lord was completely silent with respect to Saul's questions. And now you have to remember that because Saul never did the things according to the will of the Lord, but he followed the will of the people, the Lord decided to leave him. The Spirit of the Lord was no longer upon Saul, helping him and guiding him as a king. And so remember also that because now that the Spirit of the Lord is not with him, his own spirit, basically, the Lord allows for his own mind to drive him to a paranoia. He's paranoid about everything, especially about David. So in verse 7 it says, then Saul said to his servant, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. Now you know that this is completely against the Torah. Again, Saul is doing something that he knows is against the Torah, because he himself had asked that all the people that were sorcerers or mediums or magicians were driven out of the land or they were killed. But yet now he's seeking for one of the people that he had banned himself from Israel. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. So there was still somebody there that did not obey the king and was not found. Therefore, she was still alive. Verse 8 says, then Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me whom I shall name to you. But the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? So she still recognizes the ban that Saul had done by eliminating all these people from the land. And yet, he comes to her disguised not as King Saul, and she at that moment doesn't recognize him. And she says to him, you know that we're not supposed to do this. Verse 10, Saul vowed to her by the Lord. So he's making a vow in the name of the Lord. And remember that once you make a vow in the name of the Lord, you have to fulfill it, because if you don't, you break the vow, and basically you're saying that the name of the Lord has no honor, that you cannot follow your vow because the name has no honor. Basically, you're putting in shame the reputation of the Lord by using his name in a vow. And yet he uses the name knowing that he's doing something completely wrong. He vows to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, so remember that it doesn't give us details of how she was doing this. But if you study the background of the culture during this time, one of the things that they would do is they would dig a pit, a huge pit, thinking that by digging this pit, they were some way connecting to the underworld, to the world of the dead. And they would say all these incantations or these formulas, these words that would apparently bring up the dead again. So it doesn't say, but it does say that when the woman did see Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? So at this point, she understands this person that is making this request is Saul himself. And she's astonished. I guess she wasn't really expecting to see Samuel, but she does see him. And she says that she was deceived. She understands that Saul has deceived her. For you are Saul, verse 13. The king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming out of the earth. In the Hebrew, it says, she sees Elohim. Elohim. Now remember that the term Elohim can be used not only for the name of God, but also for judges. It was used for people like Samuel, like the prophets. Because remember that the name Elohim basically means someone that is very exalted, that is very close to the divine nature of God. So again, that's why you need to know the context in which the name is being used, so you don't think that who's rising out of the ground is Elohim, God himself. I see a divine being coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. Now that is important. Why? Because the robe basically represents the status and the position of the individual. In this case, it represents Samuel as a prophet. And remember that one of the things that happened with Saul and Samuel is that when he was going to grab Samuel, Saul grabbed the edge of his robe and ripped it. And at that point, Samuel, being a prophet of the Lord, understood that that meant that the kingdom had been ripped from the hands of Saul. So he recognizes and understands what's going on. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed. For the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and no longer answers me, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may make known to me what I should do. Now, this thing that we're reading here, please take into consideration that this is not a theological doctrine to follow. The Lord is allowing this to happen, but you know that the Torah very specifically says that you are not to do these things. So apparently there is a way of doing it, but the Lord does not want us to do any of these things. It's something that is possible in the spirit world. Some people have the gift of doing this, which is not for good things, because we are not to deal with that, because the Lord has specifically said it in his Torah. It's one of his commandments. Do not deal with these things. There's a lot of things about the spirit world that we do not understand. So we do not understand and know it's better to leave those things alone. But this is not a doctrine. This is not a teaching that people should follow. The Lord is allowing this to happen for the purpose of what's going on with Saul and what's going on with the kingdom, the whole kingdom. So he's allowing this to happen as a teaching, not for us to do it, but to understand that there's certain things about the spirit world that we do not understand, and we should not fool around with it. And so therefore, Saul is desperate. It's desperate. Why? Because the Spirit of the Lord is not with him. And the Spirit of the Lord is the one that gives us guidance, that gives us advice, that allows us to know what to do and what not to do. We are not to follow or ask any other spirit. We're to ask the Spirit of the living Elohim, of the living God, because he's the only one that knows all the things in our lives. Therefore, this should be taken as an admonition and not as something to be done. Now in verse 16, Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary?" Adversary, one that makes opposition, one that becomes an obstacle, one that doesn't allow you to do what you're supposed to do. In this case, it's contrary to Saul. The Lord himself is being an adversary. Now it's interesting that sometimes the word adversary in the Hebrew is translated as Satan. Now at this point, I don't think that's the way it's being translated here, but just to let you know, that is sometimes that's the way it is translated. But here, adversary means someone that brings opposition. Now verse 17, "The Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor." Interesting they use the word torn, because that's what had happened, was the robe of Samuel with Saul. So he has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David, as you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek. So the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. When he says that Saul and his sons will be with him tomorrow, I don't think it's going to be like a reunion or a family thing. It's just that basically he's saying, "I'm dead, you guys will be dead too." Verse 20, "Then Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel. Also there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. The woman came to Saul and saw that he was terrified, and said to him, 'Behold, your maidservant has obeyed you, and I have taken my life in my hand, and I have listened to your words which you spoke to me. So now also please listen to the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a piece of bread before you, that you may eat and have strength, when you go on your way.' But he refused and said, 'I will not eat.' However, his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to them. So he arose from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fattened calf in the house." Remember that meat during this time was not eaten frequently like we do here in the United States of America. Meat was eaten only on special occasions or for special visitors. In this case, the king himself is visiting this lady, this individual that was able to do exactly like Samuel had, like Saul had asked. So she takes a fattened calf, probably the most precious and expensive thing she had in her home. And she quickly slaughtered it, and she took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread from it. She brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they arose and went away that night. Why unleavened bread? Because it's fast. It's a faster way of making bread instead of waiting for it to leaven, to rise, and then to bake it. So she's doing all this in a hurry. Why? Because Saul, first of all, has not eaten. He's weak, especially after hearing what Samuel told him. And so she treats him like a king is deserving to be treated. Now in chapter 29, it says, Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring, which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands. And David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, What are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, these years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day? But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. Again, what? An obstacle, an opposition. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sing in the dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? In other words, the other Philistines did not trust David. Why? Because he had killed Goliath. So they have no trust in him. They feared that he will turn against them while they're in battle. Verse 6, Then Achish called David and said to him, As the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord. Now therefore return and go in peace, and that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. David said to Achish, But what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? But Achish replied to David, I know that you are pleasing in my sight like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, He must not go up with us to the battle. Now then, arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. So David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So they didn't trust him. So his Achish, now whom David serves, tells him to leave, and so therefore he does leave. In chapter 30, Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. Remember that the Amalekites are descendants of Esau, is one of his grandsons. Amalek is grandson of Esau. And always they have been enemies of Israel, and you know that the Lord has specifically said that all Amalekites in every generation have to be destroyed. But remember that Saul did not destroy them like he was supposed to, so therefore they continue to be an enemy, a great enemy and destroyer of Israel. Verse 2, And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. That David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Verse 6, moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So the people are fighting. Why? Because they're blaming David for what had happened. But what does David do? Contrary to what Saul would do, that Saul would listen to the people, would be afraid of the people, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That's where his strength comes from. That's where his hope is. That's where he knows is the only guidance to follow, to know what to do now in this situation. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Why the ephod? Because remember that still during this time, the Philistines have captive the Ark of the Covenant, but they use of the things that they have left to inquire of the Lord. Verse 8. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, the Lord said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men. So that means that for 200 men who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor remained behind. So remember that 600 men were following David. They were part of the men that honored him and respected him and warred with him. But he leaves 200 behind because they were exhausted. Remember, they were all crying and desperate and because of their families had been taken. Verse 11, now they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. They gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. Then his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? In other words, David saw that he was a slave, basically from whatever he was wearing. He understood that this was a slave that had escaped and had been running away for 3 days, had not eaten, and yet David is hospitable with him. He offers him food, he offers him water, he offers him a rest, and then he asks him a question. Verse 13, David said to him, to whom do you belong and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. Listen to this, an Amalekite master, because his servant is sick, he leaves him to die instead of helping him, taking care of him, contrary to David. David is generous. David is compassionate. David is merciful. Even though this is a stranger, not only a stranger, a slave of his enemy, he still takes care of him, and now he's able to ask questions and see what's going on. Verse 14, we made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites and on that which belongs to Judah and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Then David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me in the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band. Now he's swearing in his God. In the name of his God. Remember that swearing of oath, vows during this time, you always made them in the name of the God that you believed. Therefore, if anything happened with that vow, then the God had the right to strike David if David did not follow the vow. So when he brought, verse 16, when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So the Amalekites are having a feast, celebrating because of all they were able to do. Verse 17, David slaughtered them from the twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. But nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. So basically everything that they took from where David lived in Ziklag with all his family, with all the families of the men that followed him, nothing was missing. Nothing was missing, and only the Lord can do something like that, that your enemy, even though it takes your possessions, it will not be destroyed, because the Lord will take care of it if you are trusting the Lord. Remember, in whom David strengthened himself. He never had fear because he knew who was with him. So David, verse 20, so David had captured all the sheep and the cattle which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, "This is David's spoil." So they giving him a little bit more. Why? Because he's the leader. He was able to regain everything that the Amalekites had taken, and none of the people had been killed of his people. Verse 21, when David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, who had also been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him, then David approached the people and greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men among those who went with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart." Then David said, "You must not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us, who has kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us. And who will listen to you in this matter?" Excuse me. "For as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike." So it has been from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. So here again we see the maturity and the understanding that David has as a true leader. He says, just because a group of people did not go to physically fight in the war, but they stay taking care of our things, of what was left behind, they too should receive of the spoils. They too should receive a reward. Why? Because we're all one unit. Basically, by this is telling them that we're all one people, one unit. Even though one group goes out and fights, the people that stay, they're still part of us. They're holding the fort. They're praying for us. They're waiting for us. They are there standing by our side. Just because they didn't fight, that doesn't mean they're not any longer part of us. Remember that with David, it's about unity, and it's about compassion, and it's about mercy, and it's about being generous. Why? Because look what he says, because of what the Lord has given them and what the Lord has done for them. Therefore, he says, even if the people don't, certain group don't go, and another group goes, all of us are worthy of a reward. Why? Because the victory is for all of us. The honor is for all. And that is a cultural thing about honor and shame. When someone does something honorable, the whole family, the whole tribe, the whole clan, the whole nation falls within that honor. The same thing with shame. Someone that does something shameful, the family, the clan, the tribe, the whole nation also falls into shame. So David is using the tradition and the culture about honor and shame when he says this. And so they made it a ruling that David spoke to all the people. From that moment on, it became a statute and an ordinance. Now, verse 26, it says, "Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, 'Behold, a gift for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord.'" Again, the Lord, he recognizes that the only one that gave him victory was the Lord, that the only one that would allow him to regain everything that was taken away from him was the Lord. And therefore what he does, he shares the victory, he shares the honor, he shares what the Lord has given him. And why? Because these people were the people that helped him during the time that he's fleeing from Saul. Everywhere that he went, these people gave him refuge. They gave him help. Why? Because people understood that he was the true king instead of Saul. So he sends gifts. And in verse 27, to those who were in Bethel, and to those who were in Ramoth of the Negev, and to those who were in Jatir, and to those who were in Aroer, and to those who were in Sifmoth, and who were in Estemoa, and to those who were in Rakal, and to those who were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, and to those who were in the cities of the Kenites, and to those who were in Hormah, and to those who were in Borashan, and to those who were in Atach, and to those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to go. So these were places where he and his men were accepted. They were treated well. They received hospitality. They received food. They received water. So he repays them. He doesn't forget what they've done for him. He repays them by sending them gifts also. Now in chapter 31 it says, now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. Why? Because he understood the traditions and customs of war from enemies. Once an enemy got hold of another enemy, they were tortured, they were treated cruelly, and they did dishonorable things to their bodies. Why? Because it brings shame not only to the king, in this case Saul, but to the whole nation. So he doesn't want to be shamed while he's alive. He doesn't want to be shamed in a way that the people are going to say, look what happened to King Saul. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. So what? He committed suicide. And why? Because for him, it was better for he himself to take his own life than to have the enemy, the uncircumcised, take him and torture him and just do also awful things to him. And why? Because that would bring shame to him and to the whole nation of Israel. And here again, things like this concept, it was something that because it has to do with honor and shame. And if you see some of the cultures of the Middle East, even within the Chinese people, there are certain rituals and cultures where it's honorable to you yourself take your life than to let your enemy do that for you. Also, if you've ever read or been to Masada, that's what another thing happened. The last Jews that were running away from the Romans, who treated them with so much cruelty and so much oppression, the people that were left in Masada, once they knew that they were going to be overtaken by the Romans, they all committed suicide. Again, it's a cultural thing about honor and shame. They would rather take their own lives than be shamed by the enemy. So this type of suicide is an honorable suicide. Again, for us in the Western culture, in our side of the world, we don't see this as something honorable. On the contrary, we see something as not good. But again, it's a cultural thing, and that's the way they did it. And even today, what's going on in Israel, or in other places where you have all these radical terrorists, Islamic terrorists, that for them, what they call suicide bombings, to them, that's an honorable death. Killing all the infidels, that's an honorable death. So again, we can't fathom this in our culture, but that is the way it is in the Middle East in terms of honor and shame, because the culture of the Middle East is about honor and shame, while the culture here in the United States of America, on the western side of the world, is about innocence or guilt. Very different concepts. So sometimes that's why when you read the Bible, you need to understand the culture in which it was written and for whom it was written, because it's very different from us today in the 21st century and in our Western culture. So it says, so Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together. A terrible slaughter according to what Samuel has said. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley with those who were beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. So all the people that were left of the kingdom of Saul, when they saw what had happened with Saul, remember the king is dead. and all the slaughter and everything. Now they're really afraid. So they left everything they had. And what happens? The enemy comes in and takes over everything, takes everything that they had. Remember, that's what happened with the Jews with Hitler. He took everything they possessed. He took their homes. He took their riches. He took their careers. He took their lives. He took everything. And that's what the enemy does. If you allow the enemy to do that, if you fear and run away, that's what the enemy is going to do. But you have to know in whom you're standing and whom you're believing, like David did, in his belief and standing with the Lord, always trusting him, because that is his strength. That is the only way we can survive, people. Verse 8, it came about on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. Even today, this is done by all these radical terrorists, because of their supposedly false God that they serve. To them, this is honorable. That's why they behead people in the Middle East. That still is something about honor and shame. Beheading someone, basically you're saying by me beheading you, taking your head, that means that the head that is over you, your God, is also beheaded. Remember this, these are cultural, Middle Eastern culture understanding about honor and shame. So what they do, they parade the things that belong to Saul and his sons. They paraded around their own countrymen, the Philistines. Why? Because for them that's honorable. Look what we did. Look what we were able to do. We defeated our enemy. This is the evidence that we have defeated them, and we cut off his head, and look at all the shame that we're bringing upon the people of Israel. Verse 10, they put his weapons in the temple of Asherah, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Remember that not burying someone was dishonorable, so they have him hanging. Remember that hanging was one of the most dishonorable things you could do to a body or to a person. Why? To expose them to the people so they would be mocked, so they would be shamed even in death. Because why? They're doing this to the whole nation. Another thing is they put his weapons in their temple of their God, like with David. When David cut the head of Goliath, he did the same thing. The head of Goliath was paraded among the Israelites, and the weapon, the sword, was in the temple of, in this case, in the tent of Shiloh. Yes, in the tent of Shiloh. Why? Because that's what would you do. You take the weapons of your enemy and bring them as a gift to your God to show that who really won and got the victory was your God. So they're doing the same thing with their God of Ashtaroth. Verse 11, now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Now, if you recall, the people of Jabesh Gilead were a people that had made a covenant with Saul. They became servants of Saul. They paid tribute and taxes to Saul because Saul had saved them from another enemy. And so now, because of their gratitude, they came and took the bodies, and they didn't bury them, which was something that the Israelites did. Remember that the pagan nations, usually their form of burying wasn't really burying, they burned. And also even the enemies did that. So it's not that cremation here is being applauded or being shown as something that's we're supposed to do. But remember, it's Jabesh Gilead, a people, a nation that is even, they're servants to Israel. They are not part of Israel. They're not following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're not in covenant. They're not doing what Israel does, but they are servants of Israel. And they continue their customs. So they burned them. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree of Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Why? That was their custom. And even in today, even The Jewish people have a 7-day custom of mourning for their dead. They have 7 days. And so, again, we have to understand the culture and the customs of the people, of the nations that we're reading about. And so with this, we finish the first book of Samuel, and eventually, in the near future, we'll continue with the rest of the books of the Bible. But we need to always consider the context in which things are being written, because it has to do with culture. It has to do with their traditions. It has to do with their customs. And we need to know them so we can understand what's going on. Again, cremation is not something that's acceptable among the Jewish people or in Israel. Why? Because the word says, from the dirt you were taking, you go back to the dirt. We become... Our bodies are not meant to be cremated. Cremation is not biblical. Cremation was a process that was done by enemies to their enemies, or and remember that not burying somebody was an act of shame. And even though they burned the bodies, then they buried the ashes and buried what was left of their bones. Basically, it's not really cremation, because even in cremation, bones become ash. So here they burn, basically what was burned was the flesh, and so the bones, they bury them. Again, we need to understand that burial is it's a way to demonstrate honor of that individual. So now we'll go to some answers and questions. Thank you again for being here. Bless you.